Welcome to the Bible Forum. It is the 2nd of February, 2020. Groundhog's Day, they tell me. We're here for you the next couple of hours. I trust that you are rested up. You're not football fans, I can tell that, or you wouldn't be in the chat room talking to me. We've got a lot of different things we're going to talk about this evening. It was one of those weeks where the news just would not stop. And it wasn't all political, but it just came at you all week long. It was an amazing thing, and I want to jump right in and talk about something, not the impeachment trial. We're here every Sunday night for you. We've got a lot of things. We talk about the Bible, look at it through a biblical, all the events of life through a biblical lens, and politics is one of them. We're going to get to that. But we've got a virus on our hands. Came out of China. It's called the coronavirus. And everybody's up in arms. We're shutting down the world. We're not going to China. We're cutting back on this, and we're telling people to take care. You see signs, do this, do that. You know what? It may not be a common everyday virus, but it's not a whole lot different than what we've got. You see, there are variations of this particular virus. This is just one of them. CDC's looking at it. But currently there's no vaccine for this human coronavirus. But most people will recover on their own. I realize there have been some deaths. But a room humidifier or a hot shower can relieve a sore throat and cough, according to the CDC. Mildly sick patients should drink liquids and rest as much as possible. They're studying it. Apparently, this one's a little different than all the rest of them. But it isn't the end of the world. Influenza kills between 60 and 80,000 Americans every year. Drink your liquids. Take reasonable precaution. Over 20 million Americans are infected with one form of this or another every year. It's just fascinating how these things get blown out of proportion. President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu made an announcement this week, a new peace treaty between Israel and her Arab neighbors. Not everybody's happy about it, mostly as Arab neighbors. Keep in mind that this was forged in Washington by the United States, not by Israel. And it's not really a peace treaty. It's a proposed peace treaty. The media just can't seem to get it right. There were 3 Arab ambassadors in the room when this was announced, from Bahrain, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. They stood quietly. Their silence understood as tacit support. Indeed, the cause of Palestinian statehood is no longer the unifying rallying cry across the Arab world that it once was. The proposal includes a strip of land along the Jordan River, they call it the West Bank of that river, that will now, if this is approved, be under Israeli control. And some areas now inhabited by Israelis will come under Palestinian control. Israelis are not happy about that. Former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked of the Yamina party said that applying Israeli sovereignty to Judea and Samaria will prevent the creation of a future Palestinian state. Not all happy about that. Quote, the choice is between Yamina versus voting for any other party and ending up with a Palestinian terrorist state. In this so-called deal of the century, he said, if we begin by applying sovereignty, we can avoid a Palestinian state. However, if we begin by negotiating a Palestinian state, Eastern Jerusalem will end up in the hands of terrorists and buses will start exploding. Shaked's warnings echo her Thursday statement that Israel, quote, must not delay, end of quote, applying sovereignty. This is an opportunity, she said, that comes once in 52 years. I'm not sure what that number means. If we delay, she says, who knows when there will be another opportunity. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure the decision is brought for government approval next week. That means today in Israel. Also on Thursday, a senior Israeli official and confidant of Prime Minister Netanyahu downplayed the apparent split between the United States and Israel regarding the timetable for the application of Israeli sovereignty over large swaths of Judea and Samaria. He said, what has been agreed upon is a huge thing. Recognition by an American president of the Israeli right to sovereignty in the Jordan Valley, in northern Dead Sea, in the Jewish towns in Judea and Samaria. That being achieved, there's no arguing about it. It's going to happen. He said against all of this would be the radical militant Arabs who would rather die than see Israel dominating in the region. In their minds, all of this is a blood feud. It dates back 4,000 years. It's Jacob and Esau all over again. And it's not going to stop until Jesus comes. On the bright side, we've got reports indicating that the people of the Temple Institute in Jerusalem and many of the Orthodox like the plan because they'll be able to pray on the Temple Mount again and possibly build a third temple. Yeah, there's room for it up there. They're ready to go on a moment's notice. Everything's ready. A little PS here. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said he was cutting all ties, including security coordination with both Israel and the United States on yesterday, almost 2 days ago now in Israel. This in a lengthy speech delivered at an Arab League meeting in Egypt's capital, denouncing the new White House plan for ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We've informed the Israeli side, he said, that there will be no relations at all with them and the United States, including security ties. So there. He didn't say so there. I said so there, because that's what it sounds like. Which is it that comes first? A growing Muslim radicalization here in America? A growing violence-prone citizenry? A growing irresponsible, out-of-touch generation? A media-driven culture, easily stimulated, motivated towards selfisms? Or is it SARS? One viewer wrote, SARS is also a coronavirus. Coronaviruses have been around for a lot of years. Check back on the back of any Lysol spray can. It lists coronavirus. This new strain, however, has man-made additives in it, but listening to an expert talk about it yesterday seems that it's more dangerous than the common cold. Just barely. People die when they are immune compromised. Just like here, when people die of the flu complications. We've got to stop getting excited about every little thing that happens. Hundreds of people joined a new U.S.-bound caravan in Honduras. The authorities in that crime-infested Central American nation revealed that 4 Iranians were recently arrested in amongst that group. Like thousands of illegal immigrants from around the world, the Iranians entered Honduras illegally and were heading north to the United States, according to the Honduran newspaper article that attributes the information to the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. Things that we knew. This is the heading. Things we already knew, but nobody wanted to talk about. One of the things that we don't hear much about is the $3 million reward that's on President Trump's head. An Iranian lawmaker announced that fact. wanting people to assassinate our president. You saw just recently where the security forces down at Mar-a-Lago stopped somebody trying to get in. There was a whole thing. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, the car and so forth, but it wasn't just a Sunday visitor who got misdirected. Addressing the Iranian parliament member Hamad Hamzeh said, quote, "On behalf of the people of Kerman province, we will pay a $3 million reward in cash to whoever kills President Trump." How's that? British Prince Charles was in the news this past week. He got asked questions, and on Friday he expressed his heartbrokenness at witnessing the suffering and the hardship endured by the Palestinians. The remarks by this heir to the British throne, who happened to be visiting a West Bank town of Bethlehem, were described by Britain's Sky News TV as constituting, quote, "the biggest show of support that a member of the royal family has ever expressed for Palestinians." The so-called Palestinians are suffering because of their leadership, not because of Israel. Presidential contender Michael Bloomberg, who happens to be a Democrat, has made gun control a significant part of his campaign. The plan has received some blowback from gun rights advocates, as you might imagine. Jack Wilson, security guard who stopped a shooting at a West Freeway Church of Christ in Texas back in December 29th, said at a church on Sunday that under Bloomberg's plan, there would have been an extremely more severe outcome as a result of the shooting. This according to the Dallas Morning News. "If we were operating under Bloomberg's position," Wilson said, "we wouldn't have had any guns in there," adding that the outcome would have been extremely more severe than it was. You saw the films. The man had a gun. It was loaded, a rifle, and he had already shot 2 people. He had many, many more targets. In response to Wilson's comments, Bloomberg's campaign said that the shooter would not have had a gun in the first place if Bloomberg were president. Bloomberg's going to take all the guns away from all the people in the United States. He's going to outlaw guns. Nobody's going to be allowed to have guns, and then we're not going to have a gun problem. When you outlaw guns, only outlaws have guns. Wilson was recently awarded the Governor's Medal of Courage by Governor Abbott in Texas for responding to and stopping that gunman in that church. Speaking of such, Pittsburgh police are warning residents on the south side to stay indoors and call 911 if they hear recordings that sound like a baby crying or a child asking for help outside their homes. What's going on? Well, so far, all anybody knows is that people are reporting these sounds. Authorities confirmed that, quote, police have received 4 reports from different areas on the south side from callers who claimed to hear what sounded like a crying baby or at least a child's voice, but each time the officers were dispatched, they couldn't find anything. The Daily Mail reported that locals chimed in on Twitter who also reported hearing the sounds, with one person claiming, quote, my husband heard this on 3 separate occasions, spread out occasions, the last one being over the summer. It was a girl's voice in the distance saying, help me. Her husband was outside with the dogs. Twice late at night, once in the middle of the day. Look for stuff like that to come to your neighborhood. Be careful. The Supreme Court has given the Trump administration the green light to restrict immigration to the United States for those who are unlikely to support themselves without using government welfare programs. In a 5-4 ruling along ideological lines on Monday, the Trump administration has been given the authority to begin enforcing the so-called public charge rule while its merits are argued in lower courts. Under the rule, federal officials will now have more authority to deny entry to the U.S. or legal status to people who the government determines will likely rely on public assistance. The rule updated current regulations which determine whether or not an applicant would become a public charge based on their presumed need for cash benefits. Now, in addition to that, the criteria for determining whether or not an applicant will become a public charge will be based on non-cash benefits as well, such as housing assistance and food stamps. It sounds like we have adults back at the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you know what a quid pro quo is? Sure you do. We heard all about them. That's the rallying cry for liberals these days. We want a quid pro quo. It means a favor for a favor. I get something, you give something, you give something, I get something. Do these people not understand how that is used? Well, I think they're intelligent enough to know, and they have used it, but they have used it against Ukraine. You see, that they use it all the time. Presidents have always used it. Of course, it doesn't always work, and nations don't always like it. But if we are giving huge amounts of money to people in other countries, should we not get something in return, even if it's just goodwill? No, you say? Then I suggest you stop giving money to your children, or stop giving money to the poor. Almost every charitable dollar given comes with a quid pro quo, even if it's only cookies. Think Girl Scouts. We give our children rewards now so that they will do the basic, everyday, honest, right, good stuff. Used to be you either did that or else. Now you gotta reward them if you want them to make their bed. It's quid pro quo. Critics of this reality are either ignorant of life or they know exactly what they're saying and doing and are being, politely put, disingenuous. And then there's Henry Nadler and 3 other Democrat House managers who voted against aid for Ukraine in the past 3 years. Against. Why? Do they not like these people? Do they not want to rescue, to protect them from Russian invasion? They live right on the border. Well, we don't know. We can guess. Is it because they're stingy? No, they spend our money like drunken sailors on the things they like. Things they believe will help this nation become more dependent upon government. And therein lies maybe the answer. You don't like giving these people money. It might make them not dependent. Strange bunch. Diversity is something that popped up in the news a couple of generations ago, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Now we have diversity in hiring as one of the top priorities of most colleges and universities. But the effort to hire more women, more minorities, more LGBT individuals lacks one principle: ideological diversity. Now, it's well known that most faculty are composed of an overwhelming majority of liberal and Democrat members. However, this view, while generally accepted, is largely anecdotal. A new study by Heterodox Academy's Director of Research, Sean Stevens, and Brooklyn College professor Mitchell Langbert claims to have put hard numbers on that lack of diversity. Business Manager Associate Professor Mitchell Langbert reviewed the party affiliations of 8,688 professors at 51 of the top 60 liberal arts colleges listed in U.S. News and World Report's 2017 rankings. The result was an overwhelming percentage of Democrats versus Republicans. Diversity? In reviewing records with the Federal Election Commission, it was found that professors gave to Democrats over Republicans by a 95-to-1 ratio. An earlier study found that Democrats outnumbered Republicans by a 10-to-4 ratio in colleges. A recent study at Harvard found that only 35% of conservative students felt free to share their views on such campuses. That chilling effect is the result of not just open hostility to conservative voices on campus, but a striking lack of diversity among academics in terms of ideology. But we want to be fair. Our President Trump, went to Davos to speak with business, education, and political leaders from around the world. This was several weeks ago. It turns out President Trump was a hit with these people, even if liberals in this country were shocked and embarrassed at what he said. At the head dinner table on Tuesday, Viktor Pinchuk, a Ukrainian oligarch and the evening's host, was surrounded by dignitaries and leading experts on a controversial science, something called measuring happiness. Up for debate was whether governments should seek to make their citizens happy or whether they could satisfactorily measure their success in doing so. First, there was Dan Gilbert, a psychologist from Harvard, who said, of course you can trust people to tell you whether they're happy. Indeed, the most basic human interactions depend on it. Next came Robert Shiller, a Yale economist and the evening skeptic. He said happiness oscillates based on temporary circumstances and joked he'd be happier upon the arrival of dessert, which, by the way, was pistachio ice cream and mango sorbet. Anders Rasmussen, a former Danish prime minister, reflected on why his people are so happy, pointing to social mobility, environmental conservation, national culture, and good governance. Alexander Kwasniewski, a former Polish president, warned as, quote, the only one in the room who was a member of the Communist Party, end of quote, that happiness is an ideology, can be dangerous. The bottom line here, perhaps it was the wine, but the author said he was convinced that in Davoses to come, there will be less about GDP and more about happiness. Do you know anything about the global economy? Stephen Guinness, writing for ZeroHedge.com, says, I have warned extensively over the past couple of years the risk of a global trade conflict triggering higher inflation, the devaluation of currencies such as sterling, and the raising of interest rates. It's what would occur afterwards that's of more concern. When people start to look to central banks as the saviors in a crisis scenario, giving them license to digitize all assets through the network CBDCs, that central bank digital currencies. This project is an important pillar to the aspirations of the financial elite. By 2025, they are targeting the completion of reform payment systems in the UK, the US, and beyond. Systems that will possess the ability to interface directly with fintech terms that specialize in blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. I don't know either. Like cash, a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, could and would be available 24/7, 365 days a year. The difference being, all purchases would be electronic. There'd be no cash. And the logic here is if digital currencies are sufficient or sufficiently similar to commercial bank deposits, then why hold a bank account at all? What if instead central banks entered into a partnership with the private sector, banks and other financial institutions, and said, quote, you interface with the customer, you store their wealth, you offer interest, advice, loans. But when it comes to transactions, we take over. Former Managing Director Christine Lagarde, who is now President of the European Central Bank, said, quote, in this reality, central banks would retain a sure footing in payments. By extension, they would also retain autonomy over an all-digital financial system. Not governments, 5 or 6 global banks. Does this sound like anything you've read about in the Bible? China's been in the news a lot lately, mostly because of the coronavirus, but President Trump and his administration are gearing up for a long-term confrontation with China. They are viewed as a rival, increasingly as an existential threat. But a week in Davos shows that experts, executives, and most world leaders agree China's too big and advancing too fast to shun it in favor of the U.S. The big picture here is that despite Trump playing hardball on trade, the executives that were spoken to there say China remains a can't-miss opportunity. On 5G technology, where the U.S. has squeezed allies hard to convince them to shun China's Huawei, the U.K. and Germany, among others, are hedging their bets, and China is using leverage of its own. Electric vehicle manufacturing is just one example of an industry where it's not possible to be competitive globally without employing Chinese technology. The dependency goes both ways. Most consumer electronics, including nearly all computers and smartphones, are made in China, while China still relies on U.S. semiconductors and software. The trade war escalation provided a wake-up call to U.S. businesses about just how dependent they had become on China. Even if Trump is only searching for short-term political advantage, he gushed about his friendship with Xi Jinping while in Davos. The Pentagon is not happy. Heads of state now find themselves walking a tightrope between two giants. Many, if forced, will choose China. Consider African countries dependent on Beijing for investment in infrastructure. The pressure they're under is not from nagging human rights defenders in the West, according to the CEO of International Rescue Committee. It's from China. If you're in the Asia Pacific, every single country's main source of imports is China. Are those countries going to break economic relations with China? Not likely. The heavyweights of Western-style capitalism in Davos don't yet know how to deal with China's authoritarian state capitalism. The big picture here, for much of the past 70 years, the behavior of Western countries has been shaped by Western law and regulations and by the vagaries of Western markets. But now China is the first non-Western authoritarian country with both the market size and the will to reshape the behavior of multinational companies and even Western governments. Reshape them to better fit their interests. The question for you and I is, why does all this matter? The fact that the Chinese are not in any way aligning with or integrating with Western-style capitalism is something that these CEOs are having a hard time coming to terms with. Case study, China telecom giant and 5G leader Huawei has received tens of billions of dollars in various forms of government assistance, according to Wall Street Journal. This has helped it to offer its products and services below market cost, gives it an edge over competitors that top executives at Western companies are reluctant to acknowledge. The U.S. government has urged allies not to use Huawei's 5G because of security problems and the company's close ties to the Chinese government, even threatening to withhold intelligence sharing. Despite these warnings, the British government looks set to allow Huawei into its telecommunications network, and Germany may follow. The bottom line in all this is acting against the economic interests of companies is deeply unpopular among the top Davos leaders. Yet with the rise of China's authoritarian capitalism, that may be what is required to preserve the security of critical information infrastructure and the fundamental freedoms of liberal democracy. Oh, and Al-Qaeda leader Qasim al-Rimi, who once taunted President Trump for missing him in a previous strike, is now dead. Al-Rimi had threatened to attack American targets. The U.S. government had offered $10 million in reward for information about him. The New York Times is reporting that several American officials were confident that al-Rimi was killed in a January airstrike. The report said an informant provided U.S. forces in November with the location of the head of al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen. Word to U.S. embassies in the Middle East: keep taunting us. That way we know where you are. Well, that's the world in the last week. We'll be right back.